So this is the outline for the presentation today. So I'll be talking about design thinking in general and how it applies to digital products, and then how that relates to design sprints theory. We won't get into too many details about the different activities that go on design sprint, but I'll give you a very good overview so you can get a sense of what it's all about. And then we'll get more into kind of the highlighting the challenges that usually you face when you're trying to do design sprints on a services agency versus a product company. And I'll give you some practical advice about how to overcome those challenges, and some more advice about how to get started if this is something that you're looking to undertake in your own workplace. A little bit about myself. Like I mentioned before, I work for industrial media as a lead of development and solutions architect. And I kind of have a second role there, a second hat at the company as the product manager for a product that we're launching as a SaaS product. So I'm kind of, managing the team in both modes, solving problems for our clients from an agency perspective, and then trying to get traction with the product. Over my career, I played different roles, I have an engineering background, and then I moved more into more management positions from an agile team perspective, being Scrum Master or a technical lead, and like I mentioned before, as a technical product manager. So for the presentation today, please, ask questions as soon as they come to your mind. Sometimes, you wait until the end and, yes, it's too late, right? Like kind of the momentum was lost. So by all means, just raise your hand as I'm kind of going through the slides, and let's keep the conversation going. My presentation is not very long, so I don't have any concerns about, going over time because, we're taking questions as we go. So getting into the subject, so what is design thinking? And actually, maybe before we get going with the presentation, just to get a sense of who's in the room, if you can show hands, if you are engineers here, developers or engineers. Okay, so about half. Project managers. Okay, a couple. That's on agencies providing services for clients, professional services, I assume. Mm-hmm. Okay, cool. And any product owners that play the role of a product owner, UX designers or visual designers. Okay, that's the rest. Okay, cool. So there is a really good mix, and that's very important because design sprints are all about that mix and how everybody can contribute something different in trying to solve a problem. So design thinking is this concept of contrasting what normally would be analytical thinking. And analytical thinking is what typically engineers do. You're faced with a problem, and the gears start going in motion, right? You start thinking about, okay, how can we solve that problem? And as soon as you see a possible solution, then it all becomes about, okay, how can we implement that solution, right? And let's get going solving that problem. So it's very problem-based approach to solving problems, if that makes any sense. And then it works very well for problems that are well defined. By that I mean is the requirements are understood. There is not a lot of uncertainty about the different variables around the problem. So that's not kind of the challenge. The challenge is more from an engineering perspective or from a practical perspective. How do we solve the problem? Design thinking is more of a solutions-based approach. The idea is that you don't make any assumptions as to what the solution could be, and the focus is on generating ideas from scratch, from different directions about what the solution could be, right? So it doesn't frame you immediately into the solution where it immediately becomes an engineering problem. The idea is that you iterate on possible solutions and you explore different paths, and you do this iteratively until you find kind of the best solution to the problem that you have in hand. And this works very well for ill-defined problems because in this process of trying to generate ideas, you keep asking questions and you keep learning until you find things that you would normally not find, or you end up actually defining properly the problem so that then you can go into a more analytical mode and actually put in practice what the best solution that you found is, right? So in this diagram here, you can see kind of the different phases of this design thinking philosophy. And there are kind of three major areas. The first one is understand. So first you want to make sure that, again, you don't make any assumptions. So you want to empathize with who the users are or who the stakeholders that you're solving the problem for are. And you spend some time empathizing with those people, right? Then you define, try to frame who these people are, and you combine that with your initial understanding of what the problem is, and then you have a lot of conversations about that and how one thing relates to the other. And then you identify what the actual problem is, right? It might be something slightly or completely different to what initially you thought the problem was. Again, because these are ill-defined problems. This is not very straightforward to even understand what the question is or what the problem is that you're trying to solve. You have a vague idea of something that needs to be solved. Then you go into the explore phase, where the concept is that you generate ideas. You generate ideas from different perspectives. Again, it can be UX, it can be engineering, it can be the business side as well. I guess I didn't ask if there were here any kind of high-level product managers or CEOs. I guess nobody from that front. But it's important to have the business perspective. And then there's a whole different set of exercise that you can do when you have all those people in the room, and to generate all possible solutions. And then you have a discussion to get to the consensus of what the best path forward is. And then you prototype, meaning you create something tangible. It doesn't have to be production ready, it's just a prototype. And the idea is that you use this prototype to validate the ideas that you generated. You actually validate that with real users, and you run your tests. And then once you have validated that that's true, then you go into actually implementing something in your production environment or in your product, or for the client that you're working a project for. So that's kind of the circle. Not to say that these things happen in isolation and in any particular well-defined boundaries. You can jump back and forth kind of in the different phases, but that's the general direction. You start with the understanding, you go into exploring, and then you finalize on materializing whatever your idea was. Now this is a very high-level framework, and we'll see how the design sprints actually borrow from these concepts, and there is actually more structured methodology to apply these concepts. So in terms of, in our world, because design thinking is not necessarily for digital products, it's just a way of thinking about solving problems. But I think it's important to think about what principles usually kind of drive your design thinking, and what does that mean, in terms of the day-to-day interactions with your users or the day-to-day decisions that you make as you are trying to provide solutions. So there are four, basically. The first one is the 4 rules or 4 guiding principles, according to these authors from the HPI Stanford Design Thinking Program. The first one is the human rule. So it's just an idea of that you have to acknowledge that the people who are going to be using your solution, in this case, it can be a website, it can be a web application, it can be any other kind of digital product, basically, they are humans. And most of the time, they're not going to act the way that you would expect them to act, right? So that's something that has to be at the center so that your design is very human-centric. So you recognize and you acknowledge that your users are humans, and they may do things that you wouldn't expect. The second one is the ambiguity rule. Basically is that you have to keep in mind that you don't know everything, and especially at the beginning, everything is kind of ambiguous. It can mean one thing or it can mean another thing, and it's through the design thinking process that you will remove that ambiguity and you'll get to a more concrete framing of what the problem actually is. And then there's the redesign rule, and what this tells you basically is that all design is redesign. Meaning the problems, that humans experience are kind of general and constant. So really, when you're developing new and innovative solutions, what change is the technology and the way that you deliver a solution for those problems. But the problems, in essence, are kind of the same. So in practical terms, it means that you shouldn't be afraid of looking what others are doing and learn from their mistakes, or learn from other people's successes. Try to kind of find that parallels on the problem that you're trying to solve and what others are solving, and you're basically doing this constant redesign. And then the tangibility rule. This is just the idea that you should always generate something tangible that facilitates the communication and the discussion about whether something works or not. And this is directly related to basically creating prototypes, right? Something that people can see and react to so that you can actually have a better sense of whether it works or not. Any questions on this? Nope? Okay. So now getting into what design sprints are. Design sprints are a methodology that was developed in Google Venture Labs. And again, I guess what they were trying to do is to take this design thinking framework and then materialize that in a more well-defined and structured methodology that you can just take as is and then apply. If you read more closely about what design sprints are, you will see that there are a lot of techniques that you don't actually follow them all. Like you kind of make a judgment decision as you are going through a design sprint to decide what makes sense and what doesn't make sense. And you typically do that based on who's in your team and what problem you're trying to address. Design sprints are basically things that it's a process that you follow using a multidisciplinary team. And this is what I was saying before. You want to include the business side, you want to include the UX and design side, and you want to include your engineering team as well, because you never know where the idea is going to come from, and it just brings more into context, right? So your business team brings more of the the general direction, the higher level problem that you're trying to solve. They communicate a lot of what your company or the client is trying to do. Your engineering team provides a lot of feasibility assessment, what's possible, what is not possible, what might prove very difficult to accomplish. And then the design team is kind of coordinating all of these to kind of produce something that is useful and is easy to use as well. Again, this is a solution-based approach where the idea is to generate as many possible solutions as you can during the exercise and then kind of converge into one solution that you're going to test. Again, it's all based in design and creative thinking, and it's based on tangible assets. You always generate a prototype. You always generate something that you're going to show to users for them to react. And then those users will provide you the feedback on whether it works or not. Okay, so it's kind of like running an experiment, right? From the beginning, from acknowledging that you know nothing, and then framing what the problem is, hearing the voices from all the different parties that are involved, and then prototyping ideas, generating solutions, and then testing those solutions. So I'll play you just a quick introduction video that kind of summarizes this. I don't know if the audio is going to be great because I don't think it's going into any kind of speakers here.
In business, development time is a precious resource. Why are you wasting it? To be more efficient and responsive, Google Ventures created the Design Sprint, a process for answering critical business questions in just 5 days. The first day of the sprint is for sharing information between departments and creating a simple user journey. Day 2 is Sketch Day, where the team works individually to generate creative solutions to the problem. On Wednesday, the team looks at all the solutions and decides on the best approach. Create a visual storyboard, and you're ready for Prototype Thursday. It's time to get productive and build your prototype. On the final day, you test your idea on real people to see if it has any value. If it does, high fives, you're on to something great. If it doesn't, well, you've learned something. And the cost is only 5 days. So stop wasting your time and compress the endless debate cycle into a single design sprint week.
Okay, so that's from Google Ventures, and the idea with the design sprint is that it's a week long. That's kind of what they propose. Another key aspect of it is that people are not engaged in any other activity. They're solely focused on the design sprint, and everybody's there all the time. There is no okay, you guys go and do that and let me know when it's finished, and we'll do the next step or anything like that. Is everybody does all of the activities. There were a couple of things in the video. For example, they mentioned that people work individually on proposing solutions, and that's key because when you have a team and kind of everybody's in like it's a group task to come up with ideas, you end up with people not shying away from participating. And in design sprints, everybody has to create their own ideas, and it does like from the beginning it said that they don't have to be groundbreaking ideas. You have to exercise your kind of creative muscle into generating this sketch and all the different activities to kind of come out of your shell for everybody, and then actually collectively you end up with really great designs after that. And then there's one on the last part of the video when they say something like, if it works, great, and if it doesn't, well, you learn something, right? That could escape you, but actually the idea with the design sprint is a learning exercise. It's not about delivering something to production. It's not about, we have to, create something that is going to work, like no matter what. No, that's not the point. Even if you fail and you realize that the users didn't like your solution at all, you're learning because you're collecting a lot of feedback. And the idea is that if you had just run with your assumptions and created a product and you spend all this engineering effort, engineering is the most expensive resource, and it takes a lot of time. And correcting a mistake that you already released to production, that's the most expensive thing that can happen, right? That's why they say it only took 5 days. Well, you could be thinking in my agency, to collect all these people and have them working 5 days. That's pretty darn expensive already, right? But we'll talk about how you can mitigate that cost and how you can gain buy-in from your company to actually start doing some of these activities. You don't have to go all out, with everything that Google Ventures is proposing, because again, that was born out of a company that has a lot of resources and is designing a lot of different products. So it works great for them, but you'll see that it also works great for everybody else. You just have to make some adjustments to the process.
Good question.
Yep.
Are there any parts of Agile that flow into this, like a daily stand-up meeting, or the use of a Scrum Master? Does that play into this?
It doesn't directly play. I guess it's kind of the same spirit, that everybody contributes, everybody's there to try to come together and provide a solution. And the idea is to do it quickly. There is the concept of iteration. So all of those kind of elements are kind of, intermixed in a design sprint. But for example, you wouldn't have like something like a stand-up, right? Because it's not like people are going away again and then coming back and you need to this time where everybody sinks in to see what everybody's doing. Mm-hmm. There's none of that, right? Because all the time you're in the same table, in the same room, with the same Post-its on the board, collaborating, right? So there are only these very little times where you actually go away and you work on your own sketch. Okay. But then immediately you come and share your ideas, and you put it on the wall, and people vote, and on all sorts of things that happen, right? So there is a little bit of that spirit, but it's not directly related to the design sprint concept.
Okay, so that also prohibits people from doing multiple design sprints simultaneously. You're focused on one.
Yeah, exactly. I guess if you're a big corporation and you have multiple things working in multiple problems and multiple products, you could have multiple design sprints going on, but not if you have a company where there is only one team. Definitely you should focus on the one problem, because it is an investment, definitely, right? It is an investment. Great if your client is paying for it, but if it's not, or if it's you're just a small company and you're trying to implement this, then you wouldn't want to be distracted with multiple ones at the same time. I think there was another question.
What is the appropriate type, or the most ideal type of projects to bring this in on? Because it seems like if you're trying to make up a new product, then this is ideal. But what if you're, like what range, if you're doing a website redesign or something,
Mm-hmm.
Do you necessarily need something like this? Is it too bulky for that? Is there like a compressed version? And also, is there like a kind of budget range that this kind of thing fits well into?
Yeah.
And other budgets, it's
Mm-hmm.
just too much outside of that.
Yeah, I'll give you a short answer, but I have a few points later on other slides. But yeah, you always have to make a judgment call on what project makes sense to include a design sprint for. And again, it all comes back to if your problem is ill-defined. You're not certain how you're going to address the problem. Or even your client is not even certain himself what his problem is. right? They just know, have a vague idea that they need to resolve some sort of, business pain point, but you need to do more investigation and you need to do more iterative design to come up with a proper solution. I'll talk to the budget point and to the timeline and all that in a few slides.
I have a very practical question.
Yeah.
Next week, Wednesday is July 4th.
Mm-hmm.
It's a holiday.
That's right.
How do you adapt the design sprint to a 4-day work week?
Yeah, you will probably not have it on the 4th of July week because to begin with, it's likely that there's going to be a lot of people on just taking the full week or taking, a couple days, So you definitely have to choose your timing on when you do it. So that's why the design sprint is not something that you just react to. Like, you don't come up on a Monday and say, oh, wow, we need to do a design sprint right now, right? Like, at the beginning of the project, you kind of identify those problems early on, thinking, okay, in this phase of the project, these problems seem to be pretty ill-defined, so we'll probably have to plan for a design sprint. And I'll talk a little bit about how you plan these things out.
Do you ever use a design sprint to recontextualize a problem? Or, for example, somebody has pretty set a specific solution, and several people are you know what, they're going down the wrong path, and using a design sprint as a way to crack it open?
Yeah, definitely. Like if you're either like the product manager or the lead of engineering, and you're seeing a lot of risk, on the ideas that are initially being generated, this is a great way to kind of spark that idea of exploring different solutions without offending anyone's sensibilities. Is like, because it's like a collective effort, right? It's not you as a product owner or you as the engineering manager saying, no, I don't think your idea is great. It's more of, okay, let's explore what else can we learn about the problem. It might be that this solution is solving the wrong problem. So there's nothing wrong with the engineering approach. It's just that it's not the right problem to solve. Let's explore more of that. So yeah, by all means. Okay, so this is again a summary of what we saw in the video. Again, this is 5 days, but think about it as 5 different phases. So it could be that you actually do 5 half days, or you do 5 2-hour sections, or something like that. The point is there are 5 phases. And you can think about how likely it is that you can compress this even more, right? And again, it depends on the problem, whether you're going to be able to compress it in less time, or if you actually will need more than 1 week. But actually, the general idea is that you don't do more than 1 week because you want to kind of keep it focused and kind of force yourself to be decisive and make decisions quickly, right? Because the idea is that you're going to test it. So you don't have to spin your wheels too long thinking about all these different solutions. What you do is you spend a reasonable amount of time, generating ideas, and then you test the one that you think is the best one. And if it didn't work out, validation failed, well, you can plan another design sprint if you want to kind of explore a different path. Or maybe you just do the prototyping part for another idea, and then you test that. Is that a question? No.
I had more of a, I don't know if it's necessarily a question, say more of a statement, like, I know in the kind of world we all work in, there's some always sort of this thing where like, developers are like, oh, you're a designer, I don't really know what you do. You're a designer, how do you do your work? Like, what happens? And I would say this kind of, at least to me, illustrates my work process when I am individually tasked with coming up with a new homepage design, a new something. It is, I do this myself. These are the steps that I take. Faster, of course, than a 5-day period.
Yeah.
But I'm understanding, I'm diverging, I'm deciding, I'm prototyping to get to something that I feel confident in, showing my peers or presenting to the client. So I think it's interesting to see it this way, and I would say for like engineer types who kind of are sometimes like, I don't really know what you guys do as designers. How does that happen?
It's what we do too.
Right. It's like, see it out this way, then that's
that's a great point, because that's feedback that I've heard from engineers that have participated in design sprints. It's eye-opening to them about all that part that is normally hidden, right? often they're handed out like, okay, here is the final design. Please go and make it work, right? But they're hidden from that process, right? So this definitely brings it in. It's also very eye-opening for the business side, for the CEO to understand, when they ask, okay, why is this going to take 5 weeks, right? Why can it not be ready next week? Well, there is a process, right? And they get to learn what that process is and why things are not as easy as they may seem initially, right?
I just wish that this slide put more emphasis on the collaborative effort. Because when you're a one person, you can just bang through this as quickly as you can. When you're collaborating with 4 or 5, is there a maximum size that you like for your teams, or design sprint teams?
Generally speaking, you want to have at least one person from each one of those 3 groups, from business, from design, and from engineering. There could be cases like, depending on the different roles that you have in your company, you may invite a couple of engineers, or you may invite, the product manager who's not very technical and the CEO from the business side. You can make that judgment call as you're going in. I would say, definitely you shouldn't have more than 8 or 10 people in the room. More than that, then it just becomes very difficult to manage.
But when you start to throw in all these different types of people, many of whom probably haven't read very much of Robert's team building philosophy, you could spend a whole 3 days on just understanding how to communicate with each other, let alone get through.
Yeah, so the key of these, and I'll get to it, but basically the facilitator is who actually ensures that things move along, right? So the facilitator is somebody who knows the process very well, and he himself or she herself, she doesn't participate on the actual activity. That person is just responsible for timing the activities, for explaining what needs to happen, for explaining what the purpose is, mediating the conversations, looking at the clock. There is actually a clock in the table, for every activity. So to your point, it's important that things move along. It's important that when people are engaging in kind of an endless debate over a particular, disagreement, they will say, okay, for now we'll go with this, or let's vote, or some sort of, conflict resolution if there is such discussion. And but the facilitator is what is key for the success of the sprint.
So does the Google Ventures version of this specify any aspect of retrospective or continuous improvement in this process?
I don't think they're that explicit. They have a few points about what you do at the end, like once you have gone through the validation phase and how you're going to move ahead from either I learned that it works and then let's now implement a production solution, or I learned that it doesn't work and what do I do now, right? And that's what I was saying, sometimes you either just start from scratch because you realize maybe your feedback was that the problem is not even the right problem, right? You had that wrong from the beginning, in which case you just do a completely new design sprint for it. Or maybe the solution is not entirely right, but you look back and you remember one of the possible paths that you were exploring, it adheres to what the feedback from the users was, in which case you just create a new prototype and you redo the validation phase, right? So they have a few good pointers, and at the end, the last slide, I will give you some URLs where you can go and kind of get more of the meat of how to implement it. So I'm going to go very quickly over this slide because I think it's a little bit repetitive from what we saw in the video and kind of the discussion that we've been having. But basically, the first phase is to understand. There is a lot of the business side kind of explaining and talking about what they see is the problem. In an agency, that would be the project manager, who has been having a lot of the conversations with the stakeholders. By the way, if you can get the client to come in and participate in the design sprint, that's the best way to hear, from the first, the perspective from the person who actually has the problem. So it's about setting the context, right? And it's also about, once you just talk in general and set the context, you also then try to define it, to frame it, This is the whole context of the problem, and this is the one that we're trying to tackle in this design sprint, right? So you do frame it a little bit further, then you're going to diverge, which is okay, you go all out about just generating ideas of how this could work, having different approaches, and then you move into decide. So now collectively, now that we saw all the ideas, let's vote, let's discuss, and let's settle for one. And then you prototype the one. Now the shift is a little more heavy on the engineering side. They are the ones who are actually on the computer, creating prototypes. or if the prototype is just a series of mock-ups that are linked together, maybe it's the designer who's just creating the design, but everybody is looking over the shoulder and participating and trying to provide meaningful information about how to evolve that prototype. And then you go into validation, and in the validation, you want to have actual users. So if you want to do this in the 5 days, you need to schedule those interviews with the users ahead, right? You have to say Friday, the whatever, that's where we're gonna, steal an hour from your time, and we're gonna show you some prototypes, and we're gonna collect your feedback, right? So it requires a lot of planning. Again, so now how do you start to think about the different phases and the different things that you have to do? Well, the first thing is selecting a challenge. So to your question back there is like, not every problem is good for a design sprint, right? It could be a very trivial problem, in which case, yes, it's just analytical thinking that you use to actually solve that problem. So you have to be careful. And at the beginning of the project, I would suggest from an agency perspective, get your engineers, to see what's the project proposal to the client, try to identify things that are worthy of a design sprint, and I'll give you some specific examples of that. But that's the first thing, is you select what problem you're gonna put through this process. In terms of the team structure, we've talked a little bit about that already. But again, make sure you always include at least one person from these 3 kind of areas of your organization: business, design, and engineering. Schedule. Make sure that whoever you pick to participate, make sure that they have the availability, and then they're not going to be distracted with something else. This is particularly difficult for the business side because they always have meetings with clients or meetings with other organizations, and so make sure you pick a right time for them to actually be fully focused. They're going to invest the entire day, and they're going to be sitting there with their phones off, and they're going to be actively participating. And again, from a scheduling perspective, make sure that you know who the users are, because user selection for validation is also important. They have to be users who, are engaged with that area of the website or with that area of the application, not just some random users that wouldn't even understand what the context of the problem is, and likely they won't provide any meaningful feedback. Now the activities, again, I'll give you some URLs where you can go and see what are the actual activities that you can perform in each one of the phases. And if you're going to be the facilitator, you have to understand those activities, because you're the one who is going to explain to everybody else and kind of manage the people to actually go through them. In the prototyping, again, just emphasis, this is not production, so this is for engineers. You can relax, you don't have to validate, you don't have to make this hyper performant, you don't have to worry about all those things. This is about validating the solution, the UI, the idea. So it has to be realistic enough for the users to relate to it, but you're not going to use this code, you're not going to use any of these assets in production, you're going to throw it away, and then you're going to start a new process to actually implement it in your product or in your solution that you're designing for your client. And then the validation, I recommend that it's very task-oriented. You don't just show the mock-up to the client or to the user and say, what do you think? It's like, if it's a form, if they have to fill out a form, it's better if it's an actual HTML form where actually they can type, And if your problem was about some complex validation, then your prototype should be focused on the validation part of that form, because that's what you want to collect. And then you will give them an actual task. You set the context and you tell them, okay, please fill out this form, to request a support ticket or something, right? Whatever it is that you're trying to solve. And then they'll go through the task and actually experience the prototype in the way that they would experience the product if it was already implemented. And then there's a lot of observation, and everybody has to be there. Everybody who participates in the design sprint should be able to observe the user. There are some logistic problems with that if your users are remote or certain things. Ideally, you have them in a controlled space, and you can see them actually interacting with your prototype. And then at the end, you conduct formal interviews to kind of get a sense of how they felt, were they frustrated, what didn't they understand. You can get really fancy, and you can have software in the computer that will track every action that they're taking or generate heat maps about where the mouse is going. So there's a whole other thing about validation, but really the conversations and the observation is what is the most important part of validating the prototype. You had a question?
Maybe two, I'm not sure. The
Yeah.
first one would be when you said that everyone is actually physically in the room. So there is no such thing as a distributed design sprint, where you have some people off-site and some people inside.
It's extremely difficult to do that. I would advise against it.
Okay.
I would say make sure that they are there. Yeah.
And the second one is, in Agile, we have the acceptance criteria.
Mhm.
So I'm going on a riff of the, yeah. So if you have accepted criteria in an Agile sprint, you have the what defines done.
Mhm.
You have your list of tests that have been, is that worked into?
Into the whole process or into the validation?
Just in the validation.
Typically, you will hand the user a sheet where like there are different lists of things that he should be doing with your prototype. So he tries to go through those steps.
Okay.
And yes, there is one last step. They got to that point, and if you see them stuck, you will probably help them, right? If one of the steps they cannot figure out how to do it, you will probably have to guide them. It's not that you have to completely observe them and let them, completely fail and consume the whole time.
Right.
If it's very clear that they're stuck in one step, you help them get through that. You take your notes and then you move on, right? All right. So we've been discussing a lot of these challenges, but here it is in terms of kind of the different elements that play a role in a design sprint, and what is the difference between product development and professional services, right? As I mentioned before, design sprints were born out of kind of a product approach, and so what you have as a deliverable in the product world, well, typically it's just the one product, right? And you know who the stakeholders are. There is a project manager or a product owner. There are developers that are there, and they always work in the same product. So it's more control. In an agency or in a professional services world, you're dealing with multiple clients, each one of which may be having multiple projects, with you, and the stakeholders are always different, right? Every client has their own project manager, or they have, developers of their own. Anyways, I'm getting into the team now, but basically that's kind of the difference, right? So so the team, you have a CEO, product manager, UX designer, and probably a single full stack development. I know that teams comes from all shapes and sizes, but I'm kind of taking the most extreme example of the difference between product and professional services. So the professional services size, you may have the client CEO, you have your own CEO, there's client PMs, your own PMs, etc., right? Whether there is a UX designer, a lot of agencies don't have a UX designer in staff. I think that's less and less common. I think the idea of how important design is going into the industry very hard, and people acknowledge that, which is great. But there might be situations where you don't have it, and then you have to borrow somebody who's very design-minded, and then maybe that's the person that plays the design role. In budget, in a product, not to say that there is unlimited budget, but it's not control. It's not so control in terms of saying, okay, for that feature you have X amount of dollars, right? And everybody's doing a timesheet, and then you cannot exceed that, right? Which is what you have normally on the agencies. The client either agree for a fixed rate, or they're hourly, but they're not going to appreciate all these overages over a design sprint, right? So those are challenges that you have. And then timeline, same thing. You may have a roadmap on the product side. Yes, you want to deliver these features by the fall, but it's not as stringent as having to deliver a project for a client on a particular date and following a series of milestones as well, right? So these are the challenges of introducing all these complex processes in a services world.
This is great, thank you. So what would you say to an institution like MIT that produces an RFP for a website that has to meet faculty needs, a dean, and it needs to be launched by January 1st, and oh, by the way, we want to be agile and do sprints?
Right.
Besides no.
So what I would say is something along these lines. The next two slides actually kind of address that
I was
question.
hoping you did.
So if I don't, please bring it up at the end. But I want to move on to these slides as we're pressing a little bit for time. So here's all the advice that I'll give you in terms of team, budget, timeline, and then more specific about Drupal projects. On the team, always think about the roles. Don't think about the people, right? So when I said business, think about who is the stakeholder that owns the problem, the business problem, and that may be different people, for different clients, for different organizations that you're interacting with, for each one of the projects. But think about who's the owner of the problem. Think about who's going to be the best person to speak from a design perspective. Think about, there is an engineering role as well to be played. And then you just kind of fill those roles as you go for each one of the different design sprints that you are undertaking, right? So it adds a lot of planning, you kind of another layer to the planning challenge, but that's how you address it. You think about the roles, not about the specific people. Again, the second point is what I'm saying, you just basically assemble a team for each one of the design sprints. Build a relationship with your client stakeholders, talk to them often, teach them about the importance of design, bring it up very often. And then you can also kind of get your organization to start thinking more from a design perspective. So you can hold a lunch and learn, you can invite them to a talk that is being held in town or something like that, and start pushing for hiring for design roles, right? So these will build your team out with a stronger design muscle, right? And it's going to be embedded in your organization from that perspective. In terms of budget, it's very important to, at the beginning, when you are at the proposal level, collect the feedback from engineering so that you can immediately see what are the big challenges and which areas of the of the project will be design worthy. And then as you make the proposal, already account for it. And it's difficult because sometimes you're trying to match the budget that the client already has. But as much as possible, try to do that. Try to include it from the beginning so that there is no surprises later on and you don't end up with a solution that is not that great because you didn't spend enough time on the design part. You can also reduce the amount that you spend on each part of the design process, of the design sprint. Like I said before, you don't have to do one full day for each phase. It can be half days, it can be blocks of 2 or 3 hours. You can adapt that part and it works well depending on the problem. Involve the client as much as possible. If you don't want to, kind of have the expense of the product manager or some other business stakeholder, well, involve the client in the process, right? You're not going to pay for his time. He will volunteer to come to your office and to participate in the design process. And now you have one stakeholder there for free, right? So do that as much as you can, and the clients will appreciate that because they will get an insight into how you work internally to deliver the solutions that you give them. And then just constantly talk to your upper management. If you're not the manager, if you're not the decision making, talk to them often about the importance of design, talk about how you learn about this design process, how effective it is, and make a case for it. And then just from the beginning, when you go and visit your clients and you're presenting your proposal, pitch on the design part as part of your solution. Pitch it as this is a strength of our organization. This is something you're not going to find on other agencies, right? We're going to work with you. We're going to do all this work to understand your problem and to provide the best solution that we can provide you. And again, this resonates with clients a lot. You would think that it doesn't, but it does. And then the budget is less of a concern once they see the value on it. Timeline, again, identify very early on what are sprint-worthy features so that you can start planning who the stakeholders are going to be, when is this sprint going to happen, so you don't have it during the holidays or when people are away on vacation, and you start blocking people's calendars. And then in your own calendar, assign yourself time to plan the sprint. So that takes a lot of effort if you're going to be the facilitator. Or if you're not the person who's going to facilitate, then make sure that the person that you're going to assign to be the facilitator has enough time to plan the sprint, because planning is very important. Again, schedule the people's calendars early, block it, and then make sure that they're not working on anything else. And then you can always make the argument that the time that you're going to spend on the design sprint is going to save time for mistakes that you may otherwise do as you're trying to deliver the solution. And then always also include that design sprint in your overall timeline that you present to the client, so they're fully aware of when this is happening and whether they're going to be any commitment from their side in terms of time. Now, Drupal is a great platform, not only for actually delivering the solution at the end, in a way that is very customizable and that is very extensible. The problems that are and this part is not necessarily about Drupal itself, but to the question that was there before about what are the ideal problems for this, anything, for example, this is just 4 examples that came to mind and that I've seen. When you have a complex information architecture, like a very large website, and they have all this content, but the client has no idea how they're going to organize this, right? Or they already have a website, and it's all messy, and nobody can find anything, right? So at the beginning, you have to, this is a good problem, right? And then you can go through a design sprint to define this information architecture. If you have a system or a website that is going to have a complex search interface, where you're going to have a very complex taxonomy system, that's another opportunity, because taxonomy is such an important part of being able to find content. And if you mess it up, then it just becomes very difficult. Once you have the search implemented, it becomes very difficult to fix it. Custom module development, if you realize that for whatever reason there is no module out there that you can leverage, you're going to have to build something custom for the client. You are effectively building a custom web application, even if it's going to be a module in Drupal. So you have to spend enough time doing the design of that, not just leave it to the engineers to figure out. Like, involve the engineers, but involve also everybody else in that process. And then just third-party integrations as well. Because you may think, you usually think, oh, they have an API, great, no problem, we'll be able to integrate. But there is a lot of decisions that have to be made about how that integration is going to work. How are you going to deal with the limitations of the API? What are you going to do in the edge cases where the communication failed? And there's all sorts of decisions that you have to make that are worthy of having a design sprint for it. In terms of your dev team, I spoke before about how typically in a product team you have a full stack developer. Something common on Drupal development teams is to have your content builders, your front end developers, your back end developers. Definitely include all of them, like as much as you can. Make sure that each one of them is in the room, because they will be able to provide very meaningful information and help you in different capacities as you're going through the prototype phase or as you are evaluating feasibility. And then for prototyping, here's where I think Drupal actually shines, is you can use Drupal as a general framework for prototyping, right? And what does that mean? For example, you can use free hosting where you can immediately set up an instance of Drupal, and then it's just a clean environment where you can just experiment, right? And you don't care what you do. You don't care what modules you install, whether they are secure or not, whether they're going to be scalable or not. If they help you to your prototype, just use them, because all you're doing is validating the idea at that phase. It doesn't mean you're not designing the actual solution that you're going to provide to the client from a technical perspective. You're just designing it from a user experience perspective, right? So leverage those free hosting where you can just spin up a Drupal instance, and then you can start playing with it, and then you can create your prototype, and then you can throw it away, right? Because you're not going to actually use it for your production environment. Site building, just pure site building without actually having to write a line of code is very useful, because often your prototype will consist of a series of screens that deliver the functionality that you're looking for. And like I said before, just relax and don't worry about whether the module is going to work on the long term or not. And always leverage, views, panels, and blocks to quickly iterate different versions of your UI, right? So to get started, you can use these resources that I have there. There is a sprint kit. There are some examples of sprints that other people have done. And there is the last one is very useful, is the Google Ventures website, where they explain all about design sprints, what the idea is, and how you can run your own design sprint. So just learn as much as you can about the process, pitch the idea to your manager, find definitely a dedicated facilitator, choose one small problem initially that is ill-defined, and then just jump into it. Run it, and you'll learn from it, and you'll get better and better as you go along. And I don't think I have time for more questions, but I will be around if you want to have a conversation after the talk. Thank you.
So I have heard of two companies that use this and sprints. The sprints go free. UX people get one.